Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Convocation Unscripted, a podcast at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. I'm Robbie Jones. You'll notice that we're missing one this week. We're recording this on Juneteenth, and our colleague Jamar Tisby takes the day off. So we are carrying the water today on Juneteenth. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Kristen Dumais.
Hey, Robbie, good to see you.
Thanks, and Diana Butler-Bass.
Hey, it's great. Three white
So
people celebrating Juneteenth.
That's right. So each week, we take a topic from the news, we present to the group for discussion, and if you're new, we call the show unscripted because we don't really know where things are going to go or exactly how it's going to come out. And with that brief intro, I will just declare that this episode of the Convocation Unscripted is now in session. We're going to jump right in with a really major story from the week. And it's a story about politics and violence and religion. So I'm going to hand it over to Kristen to kind of kick us off here.
Yeah, we need to talk about the political assassination of Minnesota lawmaker Melissa Hortman and her husband, and the attempted assassination of her colleague, John Hoffman, and his wife. And, absolutely shocking turn of events. And Vance Bolter is the perpetrator here. And there is a lot that is known about him, and everything that is known about him is disturbing. And, I think that as we address this, we need to take space to grieve, to lament, a moment to pause, and to assess what this means for the state of our country and for the health of our country. What struck me was the absolutely shocking news and how quickly it became just part of the news cycle. An event that should just stop everything. An event that should cause everybody, regardless of which political party they find themselves in, regardless of who they voted for. I feel like saying, I'm old enough to remember when an event like this would have just brought everything to a screeching halt and caused people to search their hearts and reassess their actions. And that is not what happened here. It really is not. And so, as a historian, just to kind of put a marker here, that to say it's not that this is absolutely unprecedented. It has been a long time since we have had a political assassination in this country, and it ought to bring everything to a screeching halt. And so we're going to be talking about that today. Different aspects, what we know, processing it, and reflecting on what it means for our country and what it means for the days ahead.
Yeah, I when I first found out that Vance Bolter had some associations with evangelical Christianity, I just said, well, of course, those links are there, instead of being shocked by those links. And it was remarkable. There were some links to interesting, like, sermons that this guy had given. He basically set himself up as a self-appointed missionary to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and was showing up at churches, and they're online. You can watch them. But there, he's railing against abortion and the American church and saying things like this. Churches in America don't know abortion is wrong. They don't even know what the gospel is anymore. The American church is all messed up right now because we didn't listen to Jesus. I say to the African church, don't follow the way of the American church. And he says this toward the end as he's revving up. He's kind of doing that kind of guttural yelling that many of these ministers do at the end of these kind of impassioned pleas. And he says, America, America, behold, Satan is demanded permission to sift you like wheat. God is going to raise up apostles and prophets in America to correct his church. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Curious, Robbie, since this is Juneteenth.
Yeah.
How is that really sort of fundamentally different. I mean, I think there are some differences that are really important, but like Jeremiah Wright, when during the first Obama campaign, we heard the tape recorded videoed sermon from his pastor that was a very prophetic critique of America and how he understood injustice. And then at the end of the sermon, he said, "And I say, God damn America." And that was just taken by the media. And I mean, it almost derailed Obama's campaign. It was it became a personal attack on Obama. And Obama had to get out and basically disavow uh, the whole thing. Now, I know the difference between African American theology and white evangelicalism, and I understand how the visions of justice and right and wrong are divergent in these two cases. But nevertheless, for the untrained ear, they sort of sound like the same thing. They sound like a mad, angry pastor condemning American society, and then just coming out and saying, this place is essentially damned. And yet we're not getting any sort of disavowal from any Republican
Mm.
politician. The president has not come out and said, as far as I'm aware, and said anything about this, nor has anyone asked him to. And that's completely the opposite case. In how many years ago did Obama run? 2008?
Yeah.
Not that far off from, it's less than 20 years later. And to see these completely different reactions from the media and from the popular sort of news places, we had social media in 2008 and everybody was up in arms, and now everybody's like shrugging their shoulders going, oh yeah.
Diane, I think it's important to bring out a couple of additional differences, right? Because it's not just rhetoric of, America be damned, or, like kind of rigorous critique, theological, moral, political critique, right? Vance Bolter wasn't just kind of generally white evangelical, right? He was steeped in the teachings of the New Apostolic Reformation. And so, Robbie, when you quoted there, apostles and prophets.
Yeah.
That is really key. And I was just talking with Carrie Ladner, a scholar on the New Apostolic Reformation and the Charismatic Revival movement this week, just about her research. And I just happened to have reread Matthew Taylor's book. I think it's my third read now of The Violent Take It by Force on the New Apostolic Reformation, right? So I've kind of been in this space anyway for my own research. And what's really important to know here is that this movement has really elevated spiritual warfare, but spiritual warfare that has real material consequences. Right. And you can look at the history and see how this evolved over time from kind of more standard rhetoric of spiritual warfare to seeing, worship as warfare, the kind of Sean Feucht, right, worship music, under the idea that you're actually like in person showing up places to take dominion, to kind of seize control back from the demonic, from the evil. And who is the evil? Who is the demonic? Well, it's whoever you don't like, whoever is against your aims, your goals. So there are some very real political repercussions here. This is entrenched in the United States, also in Africa, globally. And this is the movement that was behind the violence on January 6th.
Yeah.
So this is the movement, the theological tradition. And Vance Bolter was again steeped in this. He's preaching sermons out of that tradition, right? He attended the Christ for the Nations Institute, one of the hubs of this theology in the United States. And he has been in this tradition for a couple of decades at least, I think. So he's not just your run of the mill white evangelical. He's an evangelical steeped in this kind of spiritual / real warfare rhetoric. And I think we need to take that all into consideration. And he's not alone. He's not alone in this. I don't want to, when I say he's not your run of the mill evangelical, I also want to say that this kind of prophecy teaching, this charismatic revival strand of evangelicalism is becoming more and more dominant and has been just influencing the mainstream evangelicalism and has been for really the last 20-25 years, but especially the last decade or so. So just as a scholar of religion, to kind of situate who this guy is, what he represents, and he kind of straddles, he's kind of normal and kind of radical and extremist. And that is the new normal these days.
It's really
that
distinction between the prophecy and what I was talking about with Jeremiah Wright is the difference between a prophetic tradition in Christian political theology and teaching and prophecy. And that's a place that a lot of folks don't know how to make that distinction. And you really do see that prophecy-oriented movements in history. I'm now thinking about several in the Reformation, the Middle Ages, and other earlier sorts of times, often did wind up in pretty violent places because they're really wanting the end of the world. Whereas the prophetic justice tradition often ends up exactly the opposite. It ends up with engaged political voices, and also often winds up in nonviolence because it's not in the same sense. It's not shooting for the end of the world, it's shooting for a better world. And so I think it's just really interesting to see the theological distinctions at play there. And like I said, I'm pretty concerned with the fact that we lack the ability in the media to really talk about that, because what you said is so important. I mean, and at all, it is about prophecy, and there is a difference between Jeremiah Wright and Vance Bolter, but it really does, to the untrained sort of ear, sound very similar, if not the same. But the distinctions are hugely important. They go completely opposite directions.
Yeah, I was glad you pointed that out. He actually Christ for the Nations Institute confirmed that he got a degree in practical theology from them, right? So he wasn't just a kind of casual flew through there for a night class. Like he stuck around enough to get an endorsed. It's an unaccredited educational institution, but he got the degree that they issued there. And I think what it made me think about whenever I thought about like January 6th and you start hearing, like you said, the worship music that they sing, it has turned into from a kind of, spiritual warfare, which does imply that it's kind of abstract and up here and in the spiritual realm, right? And I think what makes this so dangerous is that no, it has now been brought down and overlaid onto our actual politics, into Democrats versus Republicans, into liberals versus conservatives, and into like things like geographies are actually being thought of as demonic strongholds, right? That have to be physically occupied and overthrown by people working on behalf of God. So, like, once you go down that road, it really is. It's not just people kneeling and praying fervently for God's will to be done. It's like, praying fervently and then going to the garage and getting the gun and deciding that they're going to occupy the land and occupy the space, right? That is this demonic. It reminded me, I did an interview with Wired magazine about this, and I ended up just during the interview saying, it reminded me of it's turned kind of spiritual warfare into kind of a spiritual game of Risk, that old board game, where you're literally putting your pieces on territory and you're pushing people out of the other territory and occupying it with your spaces. And it's also just, should go without saying, but just to kind of put it out there, I mean, it's anathema, right, to anything like a pluralistic democracy, because you can no longer think about people you disagree with as fellow citizens, who you're going to argue with or try to persuade or try to convince or even accept defeat from in a political election or debate. They're simply people to be eliminated and defeated.
Thank you for saying that so clearly, Robbie, because as Diana was talking to, this is what it really boils down to in terms of what are the implications of this kind of theology for our democracy and for a functioning society. Because you're right, this is the concept of kind of demonic possession of nations, of geographic locations, of people. And so you can have some, go back to the Jeremiah Wright model. You can have some really fiery language, but in the prophetic tradition, right, what you're doing is trying to draw people into your moral vision, right? And you're trying to persuade. And you can use some strong language in the attempt to persuade. That's not really what this is about. Right. I think there's a tendency there for them to see a lot of us as a lost cause, right? We are to be defeated, not persuaded. And so it is not compatible ultimately with democracy, right? With pluralism. And I really started to sense this a few years back, right? In the heat of some of the Twitter wars, back when Twitter was functioning, having written Jesus and John Wayne and kind of getting into some of these scuffles with folks that we affectionately refer to as Theo Bros. And I started noticing this kind of language being thrown at me, and not just from people in charismatic spaces, right? Southern Baptist folks too, using words like, demonic, calling me a child of the devil. And the first couple of times that I was getting this, I just kind of rolled my eyes like, oh, you can't be serious. And then I thought, wait, no. I am going to take this seriously, because this kind of language, while it just seems, oh, this is spiritual warfare, it is also, when applied directly to a person, it is, first of all, the audacity, right? That you're going to be able to call out where who is demonic, and implying that anybody who disagrees with you is demonic. It is also dehumanizing. It is dehumanizing language. It is calling a person evil, an enemy of God. Well, what is to be done with that person? You don't reason with that person. You don't try to convince them. You cut people off from them and you destroy them.
Right. This is the logic of the witch craze, and the logic of the Inquisition, and the logic of the Crusades. And that it has seemed to me for quite a number of years that it's not simply a political movement with people with a different point of view about how they interpret scripture, but because of this piece and the inability to see opponents as human, it gets locked into the idea that you destroy anything that is not of God. And so it becomes easy to say that immigrants who broke the law aren't human, so send them off to a concentration camp in El Salvador. It becomes perilously easy to set up pogroms and witch burnings, and trials and heresies become crimes of the state.
And it's worth noting too that not everybody who uses language of spiritual warfare is going to act on that violence. But also, I would urge those who maybe sing the worship songs or who are comfortable using that kind of militant language, but only in a spiritual in a spiritual sense, to not brush off the connections that we're drawing here, right? Just because you are not using it in this way, just because you can sing, praise songs out of Bethel, and find them spiritually sustaining, doesn't mean they function in the same way for everybody else. Doesn't mean the language means the same thing coming from the mouth of somebody else. Like the words might be the same, it may be familiar, but because you actually mean it in a harmless way, doesn't mean that it doesn't have a different influence on somebody else. So we've talked a lot about Vance here. I did want to spend a little time thinking about Melissa Hortman. And, everything that I've heard about her has been really remarkable. And I think of, tragedy upon tragedy. We're taking kind of a big picture view of what this means for our country, and rightly so. But this was also a loss for the state of Minnesota, a loss
Yeah.
for her family. And so I just wanted to read a little something from Angela Denker. Angela, some of our listeners may be familiar with her work. She's the author of Red State Christians and also Disciples of White Jesus. And so she also lives in Minnesota, and she is an ordained Lutheran pastor. And she met Melissa, got to know her a little bit, and has written a piece this week. And this is how she wraps it up. In the wake of Melissa and Mark Hortman's deaths, another relevant and prescient fact cries out to be heard. Not everyone is in it only for themselves. American democracy, born of slavery, enriched in colonialism and genocide, tested in ill-advised overseas wars, is now writhing and twisting. Beset by internal illness and self-inflicted wounds, our country has never been perfect, not even close. And still, American democracy gave birth to leaders like Melissa Hortman. American democracy has, in its best efforts, expanded and given space for more freedom, more acceptance, more love. It would be the greatest tragedy in the wake of their killer's murderous and evil intent to decide it wasn't worth fighting for after all. So that's Angela Denker on Melissa Hortman.
And she just flagged for everybody too. She has a great Substack called I'm Listening. So if you want to check her out, and the last name is Denker, Denker.
And she's also, did you say she was a columnist for the Minneapolis Star Tribune?
Yes, and that's where she wrote this piece.
Yeah, she's a really good writer. So
Yeah.
I was wondering, has anyone gotten an update on the Hoffmans, the other couple who were critically wounded and were in the hospital?
I don't have a recent update.
Not today.
And were there children involved in either one of these two families? Were they at home, grown children? I don't know much about the circumstances surrounding their family lives.
There was at least one child involved, but and I believe her mother shielded her from the bullets. And there may be more. I don't want to speak with authority on those precise details, but I do know.
Yeah. And I think what's notable too is to remember that there were other targets,
Yes.
right? And these were the two that he managed to find at home. There were at least two other houses that he went to and couldn't get come to the door. Another couple were on vacation. So the violence and the bloodshed could have been much, much worse. And I think there were actually 70 targets that he had identified of individuals, including some Planned Parenthood clinics, because he's a very anti-abortion, person, and railed about that in these sermons as well. This was a big rampage.
One of the intended targets is my own representative and friend here in my district here in Michigan, Hillary Skolton.
Now, why aren't the flags at half-mast around the country for this?
Well, we know, for example, that while Trump did issue the kind of obligatory, statement from the White House when it happened, for example, he refused to call Tim Walz, and as the governor of Minnesota refused to call him. And when the press, said, "Hey, have you talked to the governor?" He just literally said, "Why would I do that? That'd be a waste of time," and just like completely brushed it off. So, he's given this almost no, other than the perfunctory thing that his office, put out. He's not given this any serious attention, no, and certainly no heartfelt call for, getting rid of the violence or toning down the rhetoric. None of that, of course, because in the end, I think this serves him.
I sort of asked the question a little bit rhetorically because
Yeah.
after all, this was the president who put the flags back up from half-mast, even though we were still in a national period of mourning for Jimmy Carter when the inauguration happened, and they never came back down
Yeah.
after the inauguration. Um, when you're talking about Waltz, that brings me to Mike Lee. I was in Europe for part of this when it happened, then I was on a plane and then I got back and this was still pretty big in the news. And so I was really curious. I wanted to see it from this angle, not just from far away. Um, and I was shocked by the fact that Mike Lee, senator from Utah, put up terrible tweets, essentially blaming, it looked like. This is what happens on Wall Street or something ridiculous. So sort of blaming Democrats, saying that it was a plot of Tim Waltz and that Democrats were shooting their own. And a- apparently, I mean, there's a big NBC story on it that any number of Democratic senators went to Mike Lee and begged him to stop and to get him to apologize. And he didn't apologize, but he did take the tweets down. So he sort of disappeared it when it seemed like it was inconvenient for people to remember that he had actually written it, but he still has not, according to all the news accounts that I've seen, apologized, especially to Tina Smith, who apparently was pretty close friends with the victims. And that's to me just inhuman. And Tina Smith's letter to Mike Lee was published in a couple of different places. I don't know who leaked it, probably someone from her staff. But one line I think will haunt me. It went to Lee and to his entire staff. And in the letter, she, and I don't know if it was signed also by some of her staffers, said, we hope you're proud of yourselves. Were you able to sleep over the weekend, knowing that you have added to the pain of the people of Minnesota and added to the pain of your own colleagues? Are you morally proud of the work that you are doing in Washington, D.C.? It was a brilliant and pointed letter about the necessity of moral commitments to treat one another with humanity. And the tweets did disappear after her letter, so I don't know if that had anything to do with him deciding to take them down. But she says that he still has not apologized.
Yeah, there's no public report of any apology anywhere. Yeah.
Right. And this was widespread misinformation that was being spread by people that I know, figures in Congress, media personalities on the right. Uh, that because he had a perfunctory appointment under Walz, and I believe he had held the same position under the previous Republican governor, right? So one of these kind of, you check a box and you have this role. That was all they needed to take it and run with it and spin absolute fabrication, right? That this was a leftist, all sorts of variations out there, when the facts are staring us right in the face. Right. This is where we started. We know who this guy is. We know the ideas that motivated him. It was very clear. He had his hit list was, all these Democratic lawmakers. He was very clear about where he stood. Did any of them issue corrections? I have not seen one. I have
Yeah.
not seen one. And that's what I'm getting at. Like, this is not, I don't want to normalize this. Sure, I get you get your facts wrong right out of the gate. Maybe some wishful thinking, at trying to spin something politically, even that's, bad enough. But from top all the way down to like ordinary folks who I saw, putting out on their Facebook this spin, completely fabricated. Did they walk it back? I have not seen anyone walk it back at best, and I mean at best, it's the Mike Lee model. Wait days and then quietly make it disappear. No acknowledgement, no correction, and no apology, right? This is what I'm saying. This is frightening. Because it demonstrates that, right? This is not just like the politics, what's happening out there in DC or state houses. This is a kind of rot that has seeped in at the public level, the grassroots, the level of basic humanity, and that I think is what I've been grappling with this week. It seems a very bad omen that something like this is just treated as everything is. How can it be spun politically to favor my side? Truth be damned.
Yeah. And I think the thing is too that Mike Lee knew better. He did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And even after getting called out on it, right, persisted.
Right.
So like, what's that about? Like, if you kind of slow it down, like I think we really do need to kind of not just blow past that and go, oh, well, it's just Republicans being Republicans
Yeah.
or politicians being politicians. No, like that's moral depravity. I mean, it is just awful. It's inhuman. I mean, like you said, to think about like exploiting the death of like a colleague, right? In that way, like, I mean, really anyone, right? But for someone who's sitting in a place of authority, who's supposed to have integrity, and you guarantee that we could go dig up some things where he's probably talking about the importance of truth with a capital T and defending that, and then when it comes down to just like basic integrity and basic humanity, if you can score some political points, it's like a video game or something, right? It's completely devoid of any kind of moral responsibility, any kind of theological integrity, and yet they just kind of plow forward. And are there going to be consequences? I don't know. You know?
How do we undo this, right?
Yeah.
How do we, because calling it out seems to do nothing. I mean, it does something for us, right? It does something. Um, I feel like for the sake of my own humanity, I need to call this out. I need to just pause and acknowledge what is happening and not let this become normal. But yeah, I think a huge task ahead of us, if we can get past this stage and begin to turn things around, how do we begin to rebuild this kind of moral fabric? I don't know how it's done. I'm sure there are lessons out there. I saw a post today on Blue Sky, something to the effect of we're going to need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And of course the implicit if we're on the other side of this, that comes after. And that's what I'm feeling right now.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time thinking about things like this when I was in Europe. One of the hardest days, besides having COVID and coming back with a cold and some other things, one of the hardest days that I had there was a day in Amsterdam where we decided that we were going to walk around the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam and go to the Jewish Museum, the Portuguese synagogue, which is one of the oldest, most beautiful synagogues in Europe, and also the Dutch National Holocaust Museum. And the Dutch National Holocaust Museum was very moving, as those kinds of things often are. And, you're kind of, if you've ever been to one of these or taken a history class even on the Holocaust. You know, the kinds of footage and the things that you talk about. And so that wasn't the surprise. For me, the depth of the feeling of the place came from the fact that the Holocaust Museum in the Netherlands is located in a building which had once been a school. And then when the Germans occupied Holland, they turned this school into sort of the gathering point, the dorm, as it were, for Jewish children that they were taking away from their families. And it was this school, this building was the last free place that these thousands and thousands of Jewish children knew. Um, from there, they would be put on trains and shipped off to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and all those horrible places. And so being in the location where I don't know about you, Kristen, as a historian, but I'm really sensitive to geographies where things happened.
Yeah.
And so to stand there and almost imagine the tears and the screams and the fears of those thousands of children was very difficult. And then, of course, the reels and seeing the pieces of people's lives that were gathered in the museum, and probably the most, and this goes to the comments you both were making, probably the most painful and poignant room for me was the room about the perpetrators. The entire room on complicity, because this is a big issue in Holland.
Yeah.
Since the Dutch prided themselves in the years before World War II of being tolerant and open. And all through some of the worst parts of European history, there was still an active, very vital Jewish community there. And there was still a Roman Catholic community there, even though Holland was a Protestant nation. And so they were trying hard to figure out how to be tolerant and how to create a different sort of society with a variety of religions, at least not being persecuted overtly. And so, but then the Nazis came, and huge numbers of the Dutch just gave in. And so this room that was dedicated to it, and you walked in the room, and the primary exhibits were pretty startling, but then you realize that around the room on the wallpaper was words. It was just like teeny tiny little words, just this really big room papered with this. And eventually you found out by listening to your headphones that those were all the laws that were passed during the occupation, taking away the rights of the Jews and other minority groups in Holland, place of utmost toleration, and that the Dutch gave in. And across the street, there's the Dutch Resistance Museum, because not all the Dutch did. A lot of them didn't. So it was very conflicted among the white Protestant and Catholic Dutch people, is that there were people who, lots of people went along, lots of people who lived by these new horrible laws, and then there were people who resisted. And the Dutch did manage to hide an enormous number of Jews from the Germans, and lots of Dutch people lost their lives. Non-Jewish Dutch people lost their lives in that. Um, but when I got to the end, I thought to myself, well, who are the heroes? And sometimes that's what it is that none of those people acted at the time because they thought that it was going to go away necessarily. They acted on what they believed to be right, and they just kept at it. And then history became the judge. And, I kept walking through there, and it was like, what history says about you in the long run, you probably deserve. And A lot of people didn't see that museum built, but they're in it, either as heroes or as accomplices. And which I kept thinking to myself, just walk people through here. Which room do you want to be in? Do you want to be in the Dutch Resistance Museum
Mm.
with the heroes? Or do you want to be in this museum? There was actually an entire display that had red hats that had Nazi symbols on them. And I went, oh my gosh. And
Yeah.
it's like they had all the propaganda that regular people could buy and put on their clothing and proudly announce that they were on the side of Hitler. And I just looked at that and I went, oh my God, there's Stephen Miller's cabinet right there. You know, um, history's a bear.
Yeah, so I think, Diana, it's worth noting. I mean lest we all think everything's better on the other side of the pond, I think it is maybe better. But the Dutch government's about to collapse because they've got a far right wing, anti-immigrant, white supremacist party in Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom that's kind of gotten way more support than anybody ever thought he would have. There's a kind of anti-immigrant, white supremacist, Christian nationalist backlash happening in the Netherlands right now.
People talk to us about that,
Yeah.
kind of side when they found out we were Americans and they found out we were safe Americans. They wanted to know what it was like living under Trump. And like one fellow actually, who was probably about 40, actually said, "What's it like to be on the wrong side of the Nazis?" And he actually grew up in South Africa. I was now living in the Netherlands.
Mhm.
He was talking about truth and reconciliation and what
Yeah.
it was like to grow up in that situation and coming then to Europe and expecting one thing and then seeing all this grow. And literally, I've never had a person in Europe stop me and say, "What's it like to be on the side of the Nazis?" And it's like,
Mm.
it's crappy. I mean, it's like, I, you know, uh, people felt we were safe to talk to when they realized that we didn't like Trump.
Yeah.
And they were eager to talk about it. And they were eager to talk about it because they were worried about some of these same things in their own countries.
Well, I wonder if I could transition us to Juneteenth on that note of kind of, long history, conflicting traditions, moments of thinking about like Juneteenth is our newest federal holiday, right? It was instituted in 2021. So we're just kind of 4 years into this holiday that, of course, has been around for a very long time in the African American community, but has not been celebrated by most white people until the last 4 years. And Jamar's not with us today because he is taking the day off, and he wrote a whole thing on his Substack. You should check out, I think, last year about why he takes it as a day of rest and not as kind of a day out, kind of being busy doing stuff. He also had a great piece he wrote about why the flag the flag for Juneteenth is red, white, and blue. So if you're looking for a read for the rest of your day today, there's a good one. I've got a couple of things to say, but I'll throw it out to maybe you, Kristen, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, I am a white person, grew up around a lot of white people, live around a lot of white people. And I have to say, so Juneteenth is certainly not something that I grew up with. And I love that it's a federal holiday now. I love that Calvin University, where I teach, uh, shuts down. That's a relatively new thing. I think the last couple of years they have so kind of paid holiday for our employees. Now, as faculty, that doesn't apply as directly to me, but my husband is on staff and gets the day off, right? And so that changes things. It really does. And so, my kids ask, why is dad home today? Well, it's Juneteenth. So what are we going to do, right? Pulled some books off the shelf, was thinking about maybe we'll go get some soul food tonight. And, right, this is a very white way to celebrate. I get that. And, Jamara would be here laughing at me, I'm sure. And, but, right, this is like, it changes things. And it's celebratory, right? How can we now participate in the celebration? I'm thinking of the piece that Angela Denker wrote, the little piece I quoted from. No, the country has not gotten it right. but this country has still produced people who show us a better way. And that is certainly the case in the African American community, the civil rights movement, right? That's our story too. And, all of the anti-woke, anti-CRT, anti-racial justice rhetoric coming from the right, that it's so negative and it's anti-American, right? That's just flat out wrong. It's not. It's inviting us into this story, right? And Diana, which side do you want to be on here? We can choose. And so, very, very white people can say, I want to learn a little bit more about this. And guess what? We're going to be, bringing things into our family and making it part of our celebration too, because this is part of our collective story. And it's a day that we can be proud of. So I love it. And, we're taking some baby steps and figuring it out as we go, but it's a really fun thing to do.
Yep. So last year I was at Chautauqua during this week, which, if you've never been to Chautauqua, it is the whitest place on earth. Right? It is
Very white.
White Christian Mayberry, right?
Lovely white people.
In New York. Yeah, up near Canada. That's right. As our friend Jackie Lewis would say, it's like the nice white people.
The nice white people tour.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I had to Jackie. But I remember for the first time seeing that they have all these cottages out, and set in little rows, and it really is a lot like Mayberry. But here's all these white, and there were like, I don't know, at least a dozen Juneteenth flags out on these, in this very white space. And I thought, okay, it is becoming, and I love what you said, Kristen, that this is all our story, right? And we have to make it all our story. I mean, I think that's part of the task here. It's not a white holiday or a black holiday, right? It is all our story. And I wrote a thing last year that I kind of re-upped on my Substack this week. But the thing that I'm married to a Jewish woman. And so part of the great things you get is these kind of you get to be an interloper on all the holidays, right? And the food and the celebrations and the traditions. And I became a little fascinated with the high holidays, right, that happen in the fall. And because there's these two holidays and they kind of orbit each other, right? There's Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And one is very kind of celebratory, and it's like you eat sweet things and, honey and apples, and you kind of think about the book of life and all that stuff, and you celebrate. And then this other one is very somber, right? It's like Lent. I mean, you are repenting, you're fasting, you're thinking about like the things that you did wrong and making amends. And I had this idea that maybe we could figure out, particularly for white people, that we could maybe make the 4th of July and Juneteenth operate like that, right? Because they're in this kind of orbit with each other. They're close to each other. That maybe we could think about them as kind of a time of kind of critical patriotism, right? Where we could have a moment of thinking. And I was thinking about Frederick Douglass, right? When he was asked in 1852, I just love this, that the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society in Rochester asked him to come chat about the 4th of July. And boy, he did not pull in. He did not. That's right. The nice white ladies in Rochester. And this is the speech where he said, "The 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn," right? And he's like, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? So I kind of wrote a piece called "What to the White Person is the 19th of June," right? And trying to think about how we could develop some new traditions and thinking about these two things. One that could be, if you're white, a little more sober assessment of the country, and then another one that could be a little more celebration of like what our best hopes are for the future.
I was just on an airplane and they ran all 8 episodes of the MLK/X Genius series from National Geographic Channel. So I had 8 hours of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X as my companions across the Atlantic Ocean. And that's one of the things I actually have learned to really love to do as a white person, is to watch films about Black history and that center those stories. And I can imagine there are some white people who watch those things and like freak out. But I love them because it, we're all human beings, and you really do know the difference between a hero and a perpetrator. I mean, it's very clear. So, they were different kinds of men and different journeys, and yet they wound up on the same side of history. A side that was working for justice and a better humankind. And I loved it. And it also, one of the things that I loved about that series is it centered the women. There was a whole sort of thread about the women they were married to and how important the matriarchs of their lives were. And so it was not all hero worship, because you got to see a bit of the story through the women who were in their lives, and the challenges of their personal lives and how that worked out in their families and how it was manifest in the lives of Black women, which was a way different piece of the story than you usually see. So anyway, I felt like that was a little bit of my Juneteenth celebration. I thought that the series was wonderful. Highly recommend. And I like reading books and watching films and binging TV series about African Americans and learning the world from a different perspective.
Great. Well, I think that may be a good note for us to, wrap it up and wish everybody, you'll be seeing this the day after Juneteenth, but we are recording it on Juneteenth. So happy Juneteenth, everyone. And I will officially announce this to a close. So on behalf of the four of us, Jamar and Absentia, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Encourage you to subscribe to the Convocation Substack newsletter, as well as all our social media channels that can be found in the show notes. You can also find us directly on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel, and on Apple Podcasts. The Convocation Unscripted is a collaborative effort between that's me, Robert P. Jones, Diana Butler-Bass, Kristen Dumais, and Jamar Tisby. And our producer for the show is Bo York, with production services provided by Podastery. So thanks again for listening. And with that, the episode is officially adjourned. We will see you next time.